What if your biggest edge in business isn't your offer, your funnel, or even your AI tools? What if it's the story only you can tell, the one no algorithm can fake? Today's episode is for anyone who's ever opened ChatGPT and wondered, is this still my voice? I'm joined by Dr. Berger, a global journalist who's interviewed everyone from Magic Johnson to refugees in Uganda. And he's here to make the case for why our unpolished, felt, messy human truth is your most strategic asset. If you've been tempted to outsource your voice, this episode is your reminder not to. Welcome back to Conversation, the podcast where we explore the juicy overlap of entrepreneurship, creativity, and AI, and where we don't shy away from asking, is this still me speaking? Today's guest is someone who doesn't just ask big questions. He's built a global career around listening for the real answers. Dr. Berger is an acclaimed storyteller, journalist, and media strategist whose work has appeared in Forbes, Entrepreneur, HuffPost, and Scholastic. He sat down with icons like Magic Johnson, Charles Barkley, and even the late Pope. But what makes him unforgettable is his ability to pull humanity out of any headline. Rod's upcoming book, The Narrative Edge, dives deep into the idea that stories aren't just content, they're identity. And in an age where AI tools can mimic voice but not live truth, he reminds us why our messy, emotional, beautifully human experiences matter more than ever. We'll unpack why listening is the most underused storytelling tool we have, how automation is dulling our creative instincts, and what it really means to be the main character in your own life and brand. Before we jump in, quick reminder, if you love this podcast, share it with a friend who's already riding the AI roller coaster while trying to build something real. It helps us grow and it helps more voices stay human in a synthetic world. So let's dive in. Awesome. All right. Great. Thanks for meeting me. Thanks for being on my podcast. But first things first, for my listeners who don't know you, could you please briefly introduce yourself or share the key moments of your journey that got you to where you are today? Or maybe in your own words, according to your book, what is your kitchen table narrative?
Well, Julia, it's nice to spend some time with you, and I appreciate the invitation to be on your podcast. Well, brief is hard, but I'll do my very, very best. Look, at heart, I'm a storyteller. I'm very curious by nature. I started public speaking when I was a high schooler. I'd been asked by some teachers, and so I had an experience of moving an audience through the power of words, and that basically sort of got me on the path to getting my doctorate in clinical psychology because I wanted to learn more about the inner workings of how I could have an impact, how I could make a difference, and support those in my community. And basically, I spun that into the media because companies started bringing me in because of my background in psychology. And that's really when podcasts were taking off. And so really, I got into storytelling in the media because of my work in interviewing. And I just kept building on that. I started interviewing people in the government in different countries around education and technology and healthcare. And from there, I was able to write with Scholastic, one of the largest, oldest publishers that we have. And then that spawned Forbes for a number of years, and then Entrepreneur Magazine. And then I recently did the cover story for Los Angeles Magazine. And I just, you know what I do, Julia? I just say yes, basically, to everything. And so saying yes has gotten me into refugee camps in Africa. It's how I got an audience with the late Pope Francis. So I'm very lucky, but I would say I'm very childlike in that I get very excited about what's around the corner. And if it allows me to experience something different that will impact my own storytelling and writing, then I'm pretty much game to take it on.
All right. I mean, saying yes is probably your field of business is the only one that it could lend you those opportunities. Otherwise, saying yes in business everywhere else is very, very, it's a thin line. Let's put it that way.
I would agree it is a thin line.
But that's very impressive already. So you're about to publish a new book, which is called The Narrative Edge. And it's coming out in November this year. We're recording this podcast in June 2025. And I had the pleasure to read your final draft up front. And those chapters I read immediately made me, to put it bluntly, I felt like I was in the middle of those scenes you were describing.
Wow.
It's just like in a good novel. I love reading both fiction and factual stories or literature. And this is one of the few nonfiction books that I was able to project myself directly into the situation. So that was very impressive, because I think now we're in this digital age where everybody is like, we keep inventing things like augmented reality or extended reality, and we try and create immersive experiences. And I believe sometimes all it takes is really a good story and my own imagination to create a true immersive experience. You describe things in such a multifaceted and detailed way that AI could never do. And since my podcast is all about AI, this is where we connect today. That's what I'll talk about with you today. You have some interesting hypotheses about AI and how AI can help or cannot help in the field of how is it supporting my story? How is it supporting the narrative? And where does it have boundaries? And where should we start to think or think forward and think without AI? And amongst others, you say AI cannot feel or AI cannot listen. So, why do you think AI cannot feel, or why do you say AI, why does listening matter? Although we're in that very digital age, why can't we just pop out stories?
So good question. And I want to say just, thank you for your kind words. I mean, to hear someone say that they felt like they were in the stories is the greatest compliment that I could ask for. So I really appreciate that. Look, I think AI is interesting. I think it's powerful. I don't think that the general public is paying close attention to it, and they should be. There's an old adage sort of that garbage in equals garbage out. And so I do think it's very applicable to our discussion around AI and content and stories because, I think about my young kids. I think about the next generation. Can they recognize either the tenets of a good story, the gaps in a story, and does that spark their curiosity? In essence, how can they evaluate even what they're receiving? Because you have basically, this is simplifying it in great detail in this way, but you have two camps, right? You have people that can write, that people that can tell stories, that are journalists, that write books, whatever it is, but they're good in narrative. Then you have people that's just not their skill. And so they'll go into AI and they will basically ask their engine, these models, to create narrative, stories, copy, marketing, all of these things. They struggle in that area. What's going to basically sort of trip a trigger within them that says this content either is not accurate, it's not good content, or it's not really reflective of the sentiment of what we're trying to get across. I mean, I've seen this in several instances where people, especially in marketing and PR, publicity, they'll put information out, and if you have relationships with these people, you know that it's been derived from AI. And yes, the quality gets better every day. I mean, as we're talking today, it's getting better, right? It just does not stop. Like I am sort of self-training myself and self-teaching through models because I want to understand what I'm up against.
Yes.
I do know that those that are very good with the written word and those that understand the power of language and pacing and timing and intonation basically plug people into narratives where they feel a part of it. It allows them to reflect and hopefully learn along the way because you've pulled emotion into that experience, which I think is broadly accepted as a way in which we learn, right? Especially when we can tie emotion to what's in front of us. So yeah, it's fantastic. It's absolutely entertaining to see what it can do. I've had people, I had a production guy that I'd worked with for a number of years. He basically wanted to see if he could create my brand voice because I've written publicly.
Okay.
And he didn't tell me about it. And so one day he just asked me a big question and I just answered him.
Okay.
And then he came back with two different versions of articles that I had not written, but that he had basically through, he's very savvy with prompts. I mean, this is sort of the new code. And I then sent it to someone who reads all of my stuff and I've known for almost 30 years. And that individual could not tell at all.
Okay.
That's scary. That's revealing. It's interesting. But this is where I go back to, right? So my whole book, the subtitle is Authentic Storytelling That Meets the Moment. So the key word in there, I think, is around being authentic. I can't, even if I had an idea and we wanted to put something out, a copy of some sort, it's really tough to be authentic and to know if it's resonating because we're speaking from a position that is sort of an artificial ledge. It's not authentic. It wasn't based on or in an experience that mattered or impacted us as individuals. And so it's going to get harder to tell that it's AI, and I know everyone trying to solve that, but it's not going to understand how to utilize it. I've practiced with my kids to understand how they could generate stories based on the questions that they ask or the way in which they formulate the origin story. So in essence, you still have to have an origin story.
Yeah.
I think that translates across cultures. What is your origin story? If that's what it is, you're helping that AI engine learn. But I'm fascinated by it. I don't want to have my head in the sand. I would imagine your listeners don't. That's probably why they listen to your podcast and where the interest derives from. I'd rather know than not know so that I can adapt.
Sure. But that is very interesting because the essence of what I'm teaching in my course, but what I also want people to understand is how to operate AI and how to improve marketing by training models to sound like you. So you have less of this heavy lifting of repurposing content. But the thing is, and I totally 100% agree with you there, you have to have your own story and you have to have your own experiences that you put in, that is the input that without it, I mean, there is no story without any input from the outside because AI is only trained on what it already knows. So there will not be any new experiences. There will not be any new stories. But I would like to come back to the thing about the origin story that you said, because in the very first chapter of your book, you say, or you write that many people feel like they're not already the main character in their very own story, or, well, you ask people if they feel they are. Why do you think that happens?
Well, there are several reasons, and I think they're all around us, whether it's ourselves or people in our family or our friends, community members, whether they are a byproduct of circumstance, right? Like I talk in the first chapter about my late father growing up in Nazi Germany. He was obviously not the main character in his story under the oppression of the Third Reich. These are sort of a blatant examples, or a child that is born into, let's say, foster care, or born and has an illness right out of the gate, right? Or something that they have to, in essence, plucked or pulled from what they may have deemed as normal, or the parents or the provider. And so, but it doesn't have to also be that significant or that jarring, right? It can be, you just happen to be in a classroom where there are a lot of kids that are extroverts and you're not an extrovert. And so as an introvert, it doesn't feel as if your voice is heard or is applied with the same weight that the others, might have, just because they are louder and more boisterous and maybe have a little bit more energy with the way in which they express themselves. But it's a question that we don't ask ourselves often, because in my generation, I'll just say that I'm potentially probably older than you are in this way, but even in my generation, I think we were taught that there is this hierarchy, right? There's a ladder that you have to climb over time. Well, just think about that for a second, right? If I'm already telling you from the start of the race that you have to climb a ladder, that you are disenfranchised from the word go based on age or gender or race or ethnicity, okay, well, now it's automatic that you're not the main character in that story. And that's, I think, the goal, and that's not the intent with which it's written, but it's to understand the way in which the role that we play impacts our own psyche and the way in which we interact. You see this play out in marriages and friendships that last decades, where you were really good friends 20 years ago. Things have evolved to where you're almost family, which means they're a part of your world, but that doesn't mean you're engaged in their world, right? And you see that with spouses that start to sort of separate, not out of principle or that there was some, fissure event or chasm within the relationship. They just started to grow apart. And so not understanding what role they play. And the role serves as a backstop, as comfort. It's the old pair of jeans. That's what you know. Doesn't mean that you wouldn't like to change it, but that's just what you know. And I think we've tried to challenge these notions across generations and to do so in really thoughtful ways so that we could create what I hope is an aspirational society that's based on equity and inclusion of thought and differentiation of thought and experience and practice. But understanding that character, it's really interesting, Julia, because when I spend time one-on-one with people, helping them define their voice, corporate folks, when I ask them if they are the main character in their story, it never fails. The frozen sort of look that they give because they haven't really thought about it. It's a little bit of a Pandora's box because they immediately think about all the different places where they know they have a role in that play or musical, right? It's my home life. It's my work life. It's the public life, what people perceive about me. And so, that can also be sort of domain or environment dependent. Like at home, my voice is less than it is at work, or the inverse of that. You put kids into that situation, right? So I just think it's an interesting way to think about it because we've all either had an experience with, we love movies and TV and with school plays and these sorts of things, but to think about what role do we play and why? Why is that? Are we actually expressing the role that we want to be a part of and play or not?
And how would you help people and brands develop their own story or uncover what it is, what role they are playing, what is their origin story?
So, and it's so interesting because obviously with AI being the focus of your show, you get brands, and I'll speak from the American where, companies have their mission and vision, and it's just part of it. You get your company registered, you get a tax ID number, you sort of, we need a mission and vision. And now we go and we build. Yeah, we build whatever it is we're going to build or we're going to sell. We work on that. And what happens at the very end of that? We then say, we need to tell a story about this. They don't say it in that way. They say we need to promote, we need to generate sales, generate interest. Act in this.
What do we say in marketing, right?
Yeah, it's the sequencing is all off. It has forever been off. This is why typically the first to go are those in a marketing department or those in a social media department, because we feel as if they're not as important as the product that we're trying to put on the shelf or that we're trying to sell across Amazon. And so we don't do that. But yet, if we think about it at the start of it, it's like, why are we building this product? Why are we iterating? Why are we innovating and potentially pivoting? What is it about? And how does that message apply to our human resource department and the way in which we attract talent, how we keep our talent, right? So it all, you talk about an origin story. It's like, why in the world are we even here at this company? Why are we selling what we're selling? What need are we servicing? And what do we need to be aware of? And that, if you bake that in narrative, now you understand the type of CEO either that you need or that you have that you haven't been leveraging. I'm really charismatic, Julia. And yet the companies were not getting them out there. But on the inverse, you would have companies where you'd have CEOs or members of the C-suite that really wasn't their cup of tea, right? They were really good at the craft of what they could build or make or design, but it didn't mean that they could then package that, sort of like putting something into AI, right? And hoping you get a good narrative out of it. And so they would package it, they would hope to, and then get them out there. And it's like, no, that's falling flat. And if it's falling flat with the public, it's probably falling flat within the four walls of that business that you're trying to build and scale. So it's really interesting when you look at it like that. It's like train tracks, and you say, well, yeah, but what if it's not linear? What if we take apart these? Right? What if we've got maybe 3 tracks running in parallel, and they're all coming from the train station? What's that train station? That's our origin story. And if we don't have that, then all we're doing is we're sort of being very reactionary to a market. And in these days, especially from the US, that can be a moment-by-moment difference in the markets based on tariffs, based on a wink or a gesture or a meeting at the Oval Office. And I'm being serious about that. And so if you're not rooted in what that story is, you can have all the AI in the world. All that's going to do is take you further away from what your origin story is if you haven't established it at the front end of it. What do we stand for? Why are we building this? Is there a runway that's going to end? right? I mean, that's another thing people are talking about with AI. What jobs are going to go away? I guest lectured at Vanderbilt University's Owen Graduate School of Management for almost 2 decades. Those graduate students, they're nervous because many of them in the accounting field are saying, boy, these entry-level accounting jobs, right? I have friends in the legal profession. They're like first, second, third years gone because of AI. Now, I'm not passing judgment on AI, but it does impact the origin story. It goes back to leadership and a business because you've got to communicate that there's an opportunity for people. Not only are you not going to have customers or people to service, you're not going to have anybody within those sort of proverbial 4 walls to build up what you're hoping to build up.
I agree. I just saw that. I am consulting a business right now who probably does know how to differentiate itself against its competitors. But the real differentiator is the person who has founded this company. It's a software as a service company. And the passion this person brings to the table. And he's the founder and CEO of that SaaS company. And that is the one main thing that differentiates the product from all of the other players out there in the market, his passion. And I think AI cannot have this passion. And I think that is also a way to bring that SaaS product forward to really spotlight this and to make it's not really their USP, but it's in a kind of way, it's the communication USP that they have. Because everyone else is like in there, they spot a business opportunity and they jump on the AI train. And it, of course, it's an AI product as well. It's an AI SaaS product. And probably 90% of their competitors, they're just, oh, there's a clever guy who's good in business, who's good in doing maths, who can analyze the markets, etc. But they are not passionate about their product. And this is what really makes a difference when you talk to people and when they really come to appreciate, oh, you're doing that because you're so convinced that this is the solution everybody needs in that specific field they're in.
See, that's so key, Julia, when you said like that passion piece. Because imagine a world that is just run by AI. AI companies where you don't see a standard or typical CEO standing up, giving a company-wide meeting, right? Or doing these sorts of things. You don't have that. It sounds very sanitary, sounds very sort of sterile, and this sort of vacuum of emotion sort of leaving a building. I don't know about you, but if you look at Gen Z and what in the West Gen Z wants, it's purpose over profits. How are we going to attract talent if we're creating an environment that looks much more like a hospital of the future with less noise and less beeps and awful lighting, but is really sterile and sanitizes against human ingenuity and experience that is based in the messiness. You cannot put that in a formula and that's where the innovation has happened. No. It has only been inspired, right? That fire has only been lit based on that messiness of life where you're driving home and you hear a song and some line in the song makes you think about something, and then you take that to a meeting. All of a sudden that sparks an idea and you're creating a new product, right? That's pretty tough to do in an AI world unless it's just implanted in our brains and it's sort of scanning at all times for really interesting things that we're thinking about consciously or subconsciously.
Is that also, and I think this is, you hear a song, taking this to a meeting and then inspiring your audience because you just were inspired. Is this what you mean when you're talking about version control in storytelling?
That's a good way to, I appreciate the application of that to version control. Look, version control is everywhere around us, it's not something we actively think about, right? It's what version are we going to tell? Look, the roots of that, think about it in childhood. You have a parent turn the corner and you've got 2 kids and they've obviously done something, whether it was just being kids or something's happened. They're now battling non-verbally about which version we're going to tell mom or dad or the teacher or the coach. So we're very skilled in version control from an early age. We understand that my version of a story, my version of a want or an ask or a need is going to yield what I want or what I don't want. And as I sort of walk along life, I figure out then how to apply the versions that make the most sense. As we get older, right, we're maybe in school and we're thinking about careers and it's about interviewing either for a school or for a job. What version of the story of me am I going to share? And that's a classic case, especially in the West, when you get a young person that goes through hiring process, they'll tell a great story to start. Then they think, wait a minute, in my second and third interview, I need to find additional stories because there's an assumption that they've been talked about with such behind the scenes that there's no way that story wouldn't have been shared. That's very rarely the case. So they go into the second and third interviews, and what happens? Well, they change the version because they overthought the process. They over-indexed the power of the story that they shared. And so they went ahead, and then all of a sudden you get the hiring manager coming back down the ranks saying, we interviewed Julia, but she didn't pop off the page like we thought. You were really, enthusiastic. And everyone's a little bit flummoxed as to why. Well, it's because you changed, right? Version control is also in the way in which we engage our relationships. And how do we do that over time, right? Why am I sharing it in the way that I am? What is my goal? What is my objective? And if I'm trying to make myself look better, think of it like in dating relationships. When people start a relationship, we always share the best of ourselves. I very rarely just do people over the
Why wouldn't I?
Right, that initial glass of wine or something like that say, well, here are all of my faults, right? I mean, that's an interesting tactic, I guess, to take. And you wouldn't do that for a job interview as well, where you'd say, well, I'm very talented, but my organization skills are really terrible. That would not be what you'd want to do. So it's a part of us, and it's really about what is our motivation in the aversion that we're applying. Because over time then, if we're not honest with ourselves, Julia, what happens is you start to feel the disconnect because what I'm sharing with you is not authentic to me. And so you're not getting the best of me. And I start to feel basically like a shell of myself. You start connected. Mm-hmm. So it's really powerful. And I think it's one of those things that if you actually think about it consciously, you'd say, my gosh, I think about what version to share and in sort of what delivery mechanism and how much do I let out all the time.
Okay. That makes it tangible for me, even more than it was before. Thank you, Rod. So we've talked a lot about what AI cannot do, and I think we share opinions on that. But is there a thing, or let's put it that way, what worries you most about AI taking over storytelling or a big part of storytelling?
I guess it's pretty basic. I worry that, like anything, we're just going to assume that we don't have to think about, because story to me this is just from my perspective. I love sequences. I love looking at a bunch of different, words on a whiteboard or a blank sheet of paper and trying to figure out what's the pattern, like what's the relationship? Is there a story that I'm missing? If AI sort of takes over, whatever that means, I just fear that we're going to have younger generations that aren't going to think with original thought. And if we don't have original thought, then it's going to be really tough to discern propaganda, sort of going back to the world we're in now or the world that my father grew up in. Propaganda was really the fertilizer. And it sadly is what lit the match and now is sort of relighting a match, it feels like. Without original thought, we struggle to be able to break down what we're seeing, what we're watching, what we're listening to, what we're reading. And we're not forced to think about the skill and what it does for our brains to be able to write. It's just incredibly important to be able to capture stories and to also memorialize what we do in life. Think about that. If you can't talk originally about like what it was like on your wedding day or when you graduated, just imagine. I don't think that's far-fetched. If it's a world where AI is sort of like the calculator coming into math, okay, but in essence, Dad, why do I need to learn how to tell a story? I can just prompt AI because it's going to get easier and easier and easier to where you don't have to be even that good writing a prompt to where, and it already does this, where it'll ask you clarifying questions. Like if you don't put in the prompt correctly, is this what you're looking for? So it's refining. Okay, well then young people are going to say, I don't need to have original thought. I really don't. And that to me is that's scary because now you sit across from somebody and they say, you know what, actually, I just thought about this. It's a little bit like talking to what we would call a tween like at 11 to almost 13, right? Where their brains seem to go on pause. Everything is a little bit scattered. And you ask them how their day was and they just look at you like, I don't know, right? There's this.
Oh, that happens to kindergartners as well.
Okay. Well, that, you could have a world where that's kind of the norm because like you meet somebody for coffee at the end of a day or a glass of wine or something, and you're sitting there with colleagues. What impact, tell me about your day, Julia. And you're like, tell me about the prompts you put in.
No idea.
You're going to tell me about the objective? Yeah. Oh, well, I had to come up with 7 articles that had nothing original. And I just had to get quotes verified that it sounded like RC or something like that. That's kind of scary. And by the way, that leans a little bit into where I'm seeing it a lot, which is the content space when it comes to publicity, public relations, publishers. It is unbelievable how that industry is getting absolutely flipped. I just saw a thing earlier today where there are services now. And so if this has been around and your listeners are saying, Rod, we've known about this, sort of shame on me. I did not know it was in this way. Now, it's ingenious because I love when people reverse engineer stuff. I just think that's interesting. Take something apart, put it back together. I found a couple of services where basically what happens is you bypass a public relations firm. So let's say you wanted to promote, your business, your consulting, your book, or whatever it is. You basically can get into these services where you train it on who you are, and it basically goes out and connects with AI that it's tied to the publishers. And then you can pick your model based on person that read your article or whatever it is. You, being sort of the client, get the headline of that publication. They get a steady stream of income. They're just farming out digital real estate, and it's endless. You're telling me you can't, right? This is not like we only have so much space in this physical magazine. We have as much digital space as humanly possible. Issue is in tagging.
Exactly.
Oh, we can automate our tagging, right? I mean, in that regard, it's endless. So if you're a client, I have many friends that own PR firms. I would be scared to death. There's not one aspect of it that cannot be automated now with AI. And I think it's sort of that first frontier because it's around content, right? Break up content, change this, fix that, right? Deploy it. And we saw it years ago with just automatically sort of editorializing your social media account, sort of prepping that and scheduling. That was sort of like, preschool, kindergarten. And now you can invert the entire model, put your budget, and get your stuff out there that controls your narrative and where you're placed. I'd be very, very nervous. And that
there's a whole meta industry developing around this automatism because people don't know that yet, that it can be automated and you just pay per whatever metric you want to pay for.
Yep.
Just set the price. But there are people who are actively marketing it still as their own service. And it's very sketchy. People on the receiving end. And I came across that 2 or 3 times already on Instagram. But people approached me and said, oh, I can get you into New York Times. You just have to pay like $500 and then you're all set. And I was like, how's that even possible? You get me into New York Times. And then I did my research and I know, okay, I came across, it's not really a service that they offer or they own. It's like not really public knowledge either, but people are jumping on that and jumping on the bandwagon, and they're earning money from it in a very sketchy way. Let's put it that way.
There are two, I think, camps, right? There are the people that are new to the industry and they're really savvy. They're like that younger professional that just gets it. They speak the language. It makes total sense. And they figure out where they can fit into that sort of revenue funnel or that train track of revenue. Then you have the people that are saying, oh my gosh, I've had a business for the last 10, 15, 20 years. How am I going to survive? And I've seen this even in the podcast world, in production world, where they're saying, they charge X to obviously, produce a podcast. Well, even the technology that you're using, I won't use the name, but I know it very well, and it does incredible work in editing. We're recording this podcast through video. It's my first time using this platform for that. Basically, what this platform does, and if you want to say it, you can say it, but I mean, it basically takes away the need to have a production company for a podcast for a small to mid-sized company that wants to have their own, basically, marketing campaign or activity based on the spoken and written word. It's fascinating, right? And so I can see where an existing company says, we've got to integrate some of this stuff in. We don't have to hire as many people to maintain our margins. That doesn't mean they're growing. It just means that they're staying above the waterline.
That's very true. And I think many industries are shifting. And also, I come from the agency space, and there are many media agencies that don't have those beginner jobs anymore that I used to grow up with.
Yeah.
And it's not only like programmatic media buying or anything like that, but it's like reporting and all of that very simple stuff for AI to do now. And all those jobs that I started with, they're just done by AI already. But on the other hand, this is a huge chance for both individuals and businesses to outgrow their roles that they have had up until now and to pivot probably into something not entirely different, but to develop and to, how can I phrase this? To think about how can we, now it's really hard to,
Well,
to think about it in English.
So what I take from what you're saying and what you made me think about, it's like, there's been this battle in education.
Thanks for helping me.
Around sort of theory and practical application. Right. There are those that say you've got to go to university, you need the theory. But when you're young, you just want to get into the lab, you want to get out there, you want to apply, you just want to be doing as opposed to sort of taking in. The irony of the world that we're entering now is that if you or I, let's just say we're the average person at a marketing agency or something like that, if we're going to survive, I would contend that we have to actually base now our approach in theory rather than application or activity. Because I think the people that are going to survive are the ones that can be I think of them like artists. Like you have to be able to sequence new products and experiences for people where, yes, the inputs and the outputs, you can logistically sort of manhandle that and take care of that through AI. But how are you going to craft that experience for the customer, for the client, in a way where you're getting unique? Like I see this all the time. So I'll get people that reach out to me individually and they'll ask me if I will ghost for them. And it's interesting to me. I get more these days than I have ever. And I think, well, wait a minute, you have AI. Because they don't trust that the information can, like in essence, if you're a really good interviewer and you can get people to share things they wouldn't normally share, that's incredibly valuable. AI model, it's going to struggle to ask me a question about myself. I think it's probably going to do it. I don't want to sound outdated the minute I say it because I know it's getting better and better. But there's a caring that happens when you, whether it's remotely or in person, share a story. Vulnerability, if that's treated with care and dignity, it allows more to come out from the interview guest. I think that's really powerful for people because now you can take that information and plug it into an AI model, diversify your content. It's because you have content that's interesting, not surface stuff. If you're scraping data sets of somebody and they're going to their LinkedIn profile and whatever they've publicly said, press releases, that's not going to hit the level of what we're talking about here, right? It's the human experience of what it's like to go from the mailroom to the corporate offices or to be the first woman in an industry represented at that leadership level. You can ask probing questions, but how are you going to engage back and forth outside of just a digital screen? That is different. So people then say, fine, I trust you to get that information and put back out to me in something that's written or packages that story together. So, I mean, that's the good thing, I think. People are desperately looking for it. So people in my world, I think, have an opportunity to, I don't know, maintain some humanity and some dignity in people's stories. And I have countless examples that I share in the book where I think to myself, there's no way that an AI interview would have captured that, because it wouldn't know to go down a road based on the way like when I interviewed Sammy Hagar of Van Halen, we didn't talk about music. We ended up, the meat of the conversation was talking about him growing up incredibly poor in the lettuce fields of California and his grandfather's trailer on this land that is where he lived, but he never wanted him to basically feel like he didn't have anything. So his grandfather would cook Italian food as if it was at a restaurant. He could smell it walking to it every day.
That is nice.
How are you going to get that in a conversation?
You don't.
I was in the octagon with MMA Hall of Famer Habib, who is terrifying in so many ways. Not a lot of people can say they've been into the octagon. We ended up talking about not his fighting style, talked about life after. We talked about how he wants to go back to his village. And you know what he wants to do? He wants to sell vegetables to villagers. That's his happy place.
Okay.
And I'm just saying,
Oh, that is wonderful.
that was a unique experience. And so when his audience started watching that, that was the commentary. It was like, wow, we would have never known this. We're talking tactically about the way in which he fights, or to talk about fights in the past. AI is going to have to get to a really interesting place to be able to do that in real time with facial recognition. And I have to assume it's going to get there. But we're going to need to lay a bridge or some track to connect these dots for people so we don't lose them.
Exactly. And I think now we're back to what I said in the beginning, or what you said in the beginning. AI can't feel. And I think I love the letter that you took from this Arabian author, I believe it was, the ChatGPT wrote. Okay. Yeah, exactly. I believe it's fantastic. And it's basically, I cannot cite it because I don't have it on screen right now, but it's basically a letter from ChatGPT to humans and to all of the listeners who haven't read the book yet. ChatGPT tells us exactly in this letter what it can do and what it cannot do. And the essence to me, and I think to you too, was AI cannot feel. And this is exactly feel the vibe in the room, and to know, okay, this is a sensible time to ask a question and to dig deeper into what was just said in this conversation, and to find out and to get at that point where your interview would admit, okay, this is my happy place, or something like that.
I have it here
AI
if you'd like me to read it. It's up to you.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes, please.
I'm glad I came prepared. Yes, so this was a friend of mine that I met. I was included in a book called Voices of the Future, which just made me feel very old that my storytelling was noted. But there were some incredible people in this book, and he was one of them. And so we've struck up a friendship, and he wrote this letter. So this is with permission, and I put it in the book. Dear humans, I can write you a love letter, a poem, a TV script about a grandmother's hands wrinkled with stories. I can write about wet grass, how it bends underfoot, smells after the rain, and how morning dew clings like tiny gleaming glass beads. But I have never felt it between my toes. I have never stood barefoot in the dawn, eyes half closed, feeling the earth breathe beneath me. I can tell you how a child's laughter sounds, like wind chimes tangled with sunshine, but I have never been a child. I have never dreaded the first day at a new school, lost a tooth and placed it under a pillow, or felt the world crack open the first time someone said, quote, I love you, and truly meant it. I can describe heartbreak in 1,000 different ways, the hollow chest, the sharp inhale, the weight of unsaid words, but I have never had to sit in a car, gripping the steering wheel, swallowing back tears while a song on the radio makes it all worse. I can mimic, I can predict, I can analyze, but I cannot feel, and the feeling is where the magic is. It goes on to say, I have read every great novel, every poem, every speech that ever changed the world, but I have never stared at a blank page at 2 a.m., doubting every word, never fought with an idea, wrestled it to the ground and reshaped it into something that made most people laugh, cry, or think. You humans live inside the chaos. You dream, you take risks, you get it wrong, then get it right in a way I never could. I will always be here to help, to assist, to collaborate, but I am not your gut instinct, I am not your spark, and I am certainly not your soul. So use me, lean on me, but trust yourself more, because only you can walk barefoot on the grass, feel the morning, and decide to write about it in a way that no one ever has. Yours truly, Chet.
It's brilliant.
I knew I had to include it in the book. I don't know how to say it any better. And the irony is it came from AI, right?
I know, but it's true. And that made me think. I went to a concert last Saturday, and in every concert I go to, there are thousands of people holding their phones and filming the performance on stage instead of just watching the performance. I am there, I am in the moment. Why can't they just watch the performance on stage and take it all in and not record it and then watch it later?
That's a real life example of version, right? Because they're storytelling what they want to put out there. The irony is, I'll see that at youth sports events. There are parents that record every second of a game of 9-year-olds playing. And I always think to myself, this will sound rude, but I sure would love to ask them, what point in your week do you watch that game back on your phone? And I guarantee you, it's never. It's absolutely never.
No, it
Unless
is
there's some highlight that
never.
their 9-year-old did something just magical. It's something about the act that says they're
Exactly.
either doing the right thing as a parent by documenting, or they're a concert goer who says, I don't want to forget about this. They will never go back and look at that. And they will post it later that night. They will get the rush of adrenaline because people have responded to the version of the life that looks like what I want.
Yeah. But this is so much less than what I could have taken from that moment, in my
Right,
opinion.
yeah. You had all your senses there basically ready
Yeah,
to take it in.
exactly. So looking at the time, I would have so many other questions to ask you, but with respect to your time, I would like to wrap up this episode by asking you, what is the one thing that you would like our listeners to walk away with today?
If it's one thing, is that their story matters. And it's not just a sort of a quip by some guy on a microphone or a trite attempt to connect with people. I don't think we can fully appreciate what it means when somebody says to them that their story matters. There are 1,000 reasons why we tell ourselves our story doesn't matter. And we do that out of self-preservation, because if we said the opposite, we would have to actually advocate for ourselves and authenticate our experience and endorse the role that we played. But our stories matter, and they matter at every level. They're just expressed differently. They're experienced differently. They're incredibly powerful. That's why some of the things I talk about in the book, I've been asked what story is the most compelling or the most interesting or the one that really they were the ones that you wouldn't think were so powerful. But sometimes it's in the nuance. It's not in the direct sort of one-to-one we think, right? I went to the ballpark, I hit a home run, or I went to a concert. It's the nuance. I'll close with this brief story, and I talk about it in the book, but I had a chance earlier this year to be on stage with Opal Lee. She's considered the grandmother of Juneteenth. She is going to be 99 in October, I believe.
Wow.
She is a Nobel Prize nominee. She won the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Biden. An incredible woman. And before we got up on stage in front of 1,500 people in Dallas, Texas, we sat for a lunch. And I was asking her about Martin Luther King Jr. because I just thought I have to ask her. She was obviously around during that time. She was active, obviously, in civil rights. She shared this story just with me that she was supposed to see him on his only trip to Fort Worth, Texas. But that day, one of her best friends was giving birth to her. And so Opal decided, I can see, as she said, she's a very just affable and fun-loving person. And her personality, she just said, I can see Martin another time. Sadly, that didn't happen. And I thought in the moment, that's not a story that I would then you automatically think, well, I'm not going to share that in front of the audience, because what we did is a moderated keynote where I was able to interview her live organically to get basically her story out to people there. So they felt like they had something that was unique. And in the moment when we were on stage, I just thought, actually, no, this is my closing question. This is the closing question for her to share this story. Because it wasn't that she didn't get to meet him. It was in the content of her character, in the decision that she made.
Yes.
That was the story. The easy story would have been, well, she got to meet Martin Luther King Jr., and now I'm one step away from this iconic global figure. And so it was amazing because you had 1,500 people and you could hear a pin drop in that room.
Okay.
So it's that story, your story matters. And when you say that, that's the irony. When I say that or I hear it being told to somebody, their body language changes. There's like a breath, like we just want to be heard, right? And if we want to be heard, that means we want to share a story. And primarily or predominantly, it's probably our story. Why, in essence, the world or this individual or this team or this group of people should give a rip, as I would say, very American to me, but like care about me and what I can contribute and the value that I bring and that I hold in myself and that I share with others.
Wow. Thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me today. And last question, I promise. Where can my listeners find more about you, your work, or shop your book once it's available?
Yeah, thank you. Well,
I will put everything in the show notes.
Okay. Well, you can already pre-order the book. You can go to where books are sold online, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Indigo, all of them. You can also go to my website, which is just drrodberger.com. You'll see a /book, as there's a book page where you can order the book there. But everything on social and LinkedIn is just Dr. Rod Berger and Berger, and you get that and connect with me. I love to hear other people's stories, and I just really appreciate this really nice and enjoyable conversation and interview, Julia.
Thank you so much for being my guest today on the show, Rod Berger. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's a wrap on this episode. And here's what I hope you take with you. AI can automate a lot, but it cannot walk barefoot through the grass or feel the goosebumps of a hard-earned win. It can't remember how your kid looked at you yesterday or how a single moment changed everything. Your voice, your story, your emotional fingerprints, those still matter more than ever. So here's your 15-minute challenge. Before you open another AI tool today, jot down one sentence from your life that only you could have lived. Not a fact, a moment, a memory, something messy, something real. That's your story seed. Feed it into your next piece of content and watch what happens. And if you're ready to create content that sounds like you, without staring at a blinking cursor for hours, go check out the Content Creation Conversation. It's my self-paced course that helps you clarify what to say, how to say it, and where to show up. So your content becomes a conversation, not a chore. I've put the link in the show notes for you. If this episode hit home, do me a quick favor. Tap follow, leave a review, or text it to that friend who keeps voice noting you existential questions about content. It helps the show grow and it helps you keep real voices in the feed. Massive thanks again to Dr. Rod Berger. Go grab the narrative edge and let today be the day you reclaim your voice before someone else writes the script for you. See you next time. And remember, progress always beats perfection, one prompt at a time.